There is a security camera recording from a converted coal surface facility deep in the gorge country of Buchanan County, Virginia, that has never been made public. The organization that commissioned the facility made certain of that. The footage runs from 11 minutes after the power grid failed on a January night in 2006 until the first vehicle from the organization arrived at the facility just before dawn. What that camera captured in those hours is a Dogman moving free through a building that had been designed and funded at considerable expense to contain it permanently. The footage exists. It is in the possession of the people who funded the operation, and they have every incentive to ensure it stays there. The only person who walked out of that building on that January night works in a city he has asked us not to name. He agreed to speak with us by phone across multiple conversations on the condition that his real name, his location, and certain details about his background stay undisclosed. The name has been changed. His request. Once you understand what was done with the bodies of the 8 people who did not leave that building, you will understand why. We will call him Mitch. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. Mitch was born in Dickinson County, Virginia, the county south of Buchanan, in the deep coalfield country of far southwestern Virginia, where the ridge and hollow landscape of the Appalachian Plateau runs into the Virginia-Kentucky border, and the hills get steep enough that some hollows do not see direct sunlight until mid-morning on the clearest days of the year. The county seat of Dickinson County is Clintwood, a small town on the Pound River, and the county itself has fewer than 15,000 residents across its several hundred square miles, most of them distributed in communities along the river bottoms that hold the county's roads and what remains of its coal infrastructure. His father drove a water truck for a surface mining operation for most of Mitch's childhood. His mother worked at a medical clinic in Clintwood. There were 2 children, Mitch and an older sister. Nothing about the household was unusual for the region or the time, which is to say it was a household built around practical work, practical concerns, and the specific intelligence that grows in people who spend their lives in terrain that does not accommodate carelessness. He was comfortable with animals from an early age in the way that some people simply are, without explanation or precedent in the family. Not comfortable in the performing sense, not comfortable as in willing to approach. Comfortable in the sense that animals in distress responded differently to him than to other people. A dog that had been struck by a vehicle and was biting anyone who came near it would let Mitch reach it. A barn cat that had been feral for 3 years came to him within a week of his family moving to a rental property where the cat had been living. He said he did not do anything differently than other people did. He paid attention. He moved slowly. He understood, without being taught it, that what a frightened thing needed most was evidence that the immediate environment was not going to change faster than it could process. After high school, he enrolled in an animal science program at a vocational college in Southwest Virginia and completed his coursework before the money ran out somewhere in his 2nd year. He had been working part-time during the program at a small animal veterinary clinic in Norton, which sits just over the Wise County line from Dickinson, and he stayed on there after leaving the program. He added work in his mid-20s at a wildlife rehabilitation facility in Lee County that took in injured birds of prey and the occasional black bear that had been orphaned or hit by a vehicle on one of the county roads. He handled a mountain lion once, a young female that had come down from the ridges on the Kentucky side with a compound fracture in her right rear leg. Brought in by a state game warden who had no idea what to do with it. Mitch was the primary handler for that animal for the 3 weeks before she was transferred to a facility in Tennessee that could provide long-term care. He described the mountain lion's adjustment to his presence not as trust, because trust was not the word for it, but as a state close enough to trust that it functioned the same way. An acknowledgement that his approach would remain consistent, and that consistent meant safe. He said you had to earn that acknowledgement fresh every time you entered the space. The minute you stopped earning it, it was gone. That background is why Morris called him back after the initial phone screening. In early 2004, Mitch saw an employment listing on a paper card posted at the unemployment office in Norton, Virginia. He described the card to us during our first phone call with the specificity of someone who has replayed a particular memory many times. The listing described a position with a private wildlife research organization. It used the phrase unique specimen to describe what the position involved. The salary was more than twice what the clinic in Norton was paying him. There was a phone number for a contact named Morris, and a note that applicants must be willing to relocate to a rural facility and sign a confidentiality agreement before employment could begin. No address, no organizational name, no credential requirements beyond demonstrated experience with large captive animals in high-stress conditions. He called the number that afternoon. Morris ran the screening call with the efficiency of someone who had done it before and stripped away everything that did not produce useful information. He asked about the specific animals Mitch had worked with, the years of experience, the exposure to captive animals that had come through trauma, the ability to maintain composure when most people would not. He asked about Mitch's family situation, whether personal relationships would create complications for an extended assignment at a remote site. He asked specifically and without apparent discomfort whether Mitch had any history of anxiety in enclosed spaces or difficulty regulating his own responses under extended stress. He said the position involved working in close proximity to a specimen that most people found unsettling at first encounter, and that the ability to stay calm was essential to the work. Mitch told Morris about the mountain lion. Morris noted it. The call ran 40 minutes. At the end, Morris told him he was advancing in the process and that an orientation at the facility would be arranged.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the Dogman Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
4 days later, a man in a white pickup truck arrived at Mitch's apartment in Norton at 7 in the morning and drove him west and south into Buchanan County. The route took them through Grundy, which is the county seat of Buchanan County, and sits where the Levisa fork of the Big Sandy River bends south through a gap in the ridgeline at the edge of the Coalfield Plateau. Grundy has fewer than 1,000 permanent residents at this point in the century, and it has the specific quality of a town built for a larger population that the economy eventually contracted away from. Coal companies built the infrastructure and the coal companies left, and what remains is the infrastructure and the people who stayed. South of Grundy, the county road narrowed progressively, and then turned to gravel about 6 miles in, and then to a rough track that had been regraded recently for vehicle passage without being maintained to any standard beyond functional. The forest pressed close on both sides. The hollows deepened. The sandstone ridgelines that formed the backbone of the Virginia coalfield country began to show themselves through the canopy at the ridge cuts, gray and layered, with the specific quality of stone that has been in place long enough that it has opinions about what happens on top of it. Mitch described losing his sense of direction on the county roads because the terrain does not allow for the sight lines that allow you to maintain compass orientation. You move through corridors, hollow to hollow, ridge cut to ridge cut, without any fixed point to triangulate against. And if you do not know the roads intimately, you do not know where you are. Buchanan County is among the most isolated counties in Virginia, which has many isolated counties in its southwestern corner. Its population has been declining since the coal economy peaked and retreated. It has no interstate highway within its boundaries. The nearest interchange of any significance is in Tazewell County to the west or in Mingo County, West Virginia, to the north and east. The county's two main population areas, Grundy and the communities along the Levisa Fork Valley, together hold a few thousand people. Everything else is ridge and hollow and the kind of forest that grows back fast over industrial ground when the industry pulls out. The Russell Fork of the Big Sandy is the county's other significant waterway, a tributary of the Levisa that drains the county's southeastern section before joining the Levisa at Hasey. The Russell Fork is known among the people who spend time in that country for two things: the whitewater in October when the Breaks Spillway is managed and the river runs through the Breaks Gorge at levels that make it one of the most demanding whitewater runs in the eastern United States, and the Breaks itself, the gorge that the Russell Fork has cut through Pine Mountain on the Virginia-Kentucky border over millions of years. The Breaks Interstate Park, managed jointly by Virginia and Kentucky, sits at the gorge's head, and the walls at certain sections run more than 1,600 feet from rim to river, which makes the Breaks the deepest gorge east of the Mississippi River. The Virginia end of Pine Mountain, above the gorge, is wilderness terrain that does not see much foot traffic even from people who know it is there. The hollows that run off the Russell Fork and its tributaries in that section of the county are deep and narrow, and the canopy closes overhead at the bottom. The facility sat on private land about 11 miles southeast of Grundy in the upper Russell Fork drainage, at the end of a private access tract that had been cut originally by a coal company in the 1970s for access to a series of drift mines in the adjacent hillsides. The coal company had gone under in the late 1980s, the mines had sealed, and the surface infrastructure had been abandoned in the way that coal infrastructure in southwestern Virginia tends to be abandoned, which is completely and without any plan for what comes after. What remained on the property by 2003, when the organization acquired it, was a coal preparation plant, a multi-story concrete structure built in the 1960s with walls poured in sections between 18 inches and 2.5 feet thick, designed to last for the expected life of the mines it served. The mines had outlasted the company, and the company had outlasted the preparation plant's useful life. But the concrete shell was sound. It sat at the head of a hollow against a sandstone face that formed the hollow's back wall, screened from any sight line by the terrain and the tree growth, with a seasonal creek running through the bottom of the hollow 20 yards from the building's south face. The organization had gutted the interior, poured new concrete floors, installed mechanical systems and living infrastructure, reinforced the building's internal structure at specific load points, and in the lowest and most internal section of the main building, behind a reinforced door in the original foundation level, constructed the containment room. Mitch arrived at the facility in early afternoon. Morris met him at the exterior door on the south face, a steel door with no markings and a keypad lock. The first thing Mitch registered when Morris opened the door was the smell. Not a bad smell, or not exactly a bad smell. A quality dense and layered, animal and mineral, and a quality he did not have a precise word for. A heaviness in the air that was not the normal smell of a concrete building with limited ventilation. He attributed it to the ventilation system in a thick-walled structure at the bottom of a hollow with limited air movement. He would come to understand that the smell was not the building. It was what was in the building. Morris walked him through the facility without front-loading any explanation of what the facility was for. The tour was operational: kitchen, dormitory areas for the resident staff, supply room, security monitoring station that covered the interior and perimeter cameras, generator room, emergency protocol equipment. Mitch noted the keypad locks on every exterior and interior door, the radio communication system, the protocol requiring 2 staff members present for any access to what Morris called the primary containment area. He noticed the complete absence of any organizational branding anywhere in the facility. No logos on the vehicles outside, no institutional names on the equipment, no documentation visible in the common areas. The facility operated under a studied anonymity that Mitch recognized in retrospect as the product of long practice. At the far end of the main corridor, Morris brought him through a reinforced door into a small anteroom, roughly 10 by 12 feet, with a second reinforced door at the far end. Morris explained the double-door protocol. Both doors could not be opened simultaneously. You entered from the corridor side, the corridor door locked behind you, and only then could you open the door to the containment room. He used a code on the electronic keypad. Mitch followed him through. The containment room was large, built from the original building's foundation-level space that had been the coal preparation plant's main processing floor. A 40 by 50-foot concrete box with a 20-foot ceiling. Fluorescent lighting on a suspended framework overhead. Drainage channels in the floor. A feeding port set low in the near wall, reinforced with steel plating around the opening. A cleaning port at the base of the same wall. And in the center of the room, occupying something close to 400 square feet. A cage built from 3-inch steel bar stock set in a welded frame that ran floor to ceiling, with a double-door entry secured by mechanical and electronic hardware, and inside it a steel platform about 8 feet up on the back wall, a feeding trough on the cage floor, and a quantity of heavy canvas bedding that had been gathered and rearranged by its occupant into a structure in the far corner that suggested nesting behavior. The far corner of the cage held what Mitch had been brought here to manage. It was sitting on the floor with its back against the bars, knees drawn up, arms resting along the tops of its knees, in a posture so close to how a person sits when they have learned to take up as little space as possible that Mitch's mind went to person before it went to anything else. Then the proportions began to register. The shoulders were wider than the height suggested. The arms were longer than the shoulder width supported. The hands resting on the drawn-up knees had fingers that were too long, tipped with something curved and dark. And the head, visible above the drawn-up knees in the flat light of the fluorescence, was wrong in a way that the other wrongness organized itself around. The skull ran too far forward. The face projected several inches beyond where a human face would end, into a muzzle that was canine in shape, clear and clear. The ears were visible above the roofline of the skull, pointed, set high and forward. The body was covered in dense dark hair, nearly black, uniformly distributed across the torso and limbs. The eyes were closed. The chest rose and fell slowly. It was asleep, or in a state adjacent to sleep. Morris let Mitch stand there for about 30 seconds without speaking. When Mitch finally said anything, the first thing he said was that he needed a minute. Morris said he had one. The briefing that followed covered operational parameters rather than natural history. The subject had been at the facility since the spring of 2003, following an incident on a remote mine road in the county's southern section, in which the subject had been injured by a collision with a coal truck and had been secured by Morris's team while incapacitated. The subject was adult and male. Morris estimated its standing height at approximately 7 feet 8 inches and its weight at around 385 pounds. Based on measurements taken during the single sedation event conducted about 3 months after the subject's arrival. The sedation had been complex enough that Morris had not attempted a second. The subject's health was maintained through dietary management and monitoring. The facility was currently in what Morris called a response mapping phase of its research program. Mitch's primary responsibilities were dietary management, the preparation and delivery of feeding allocations, and enclosure maintenance during the scheduled cleaning windows. He would be oriented by the existing animal handler before working independently. The staff Mitch met over his first day occupied 9 positions, counting himself. Morris as director, a man named Drew, the other animal handler who had been at the facility since its first operational month. 2 security personnel working alternating shifts. A woman named Leanne who managed the documentation systems, behavioral logs, and facility communications. Two researchers who spent most of their time in the monitoring station reviewing footage and occasionally conducting what the facility's protocols called observational assessments from outside the cage. A maintenance technician named Kyle, who managed the mechanical systems, the generator, the HVAC, and the water supply from the facility's cistern. And Mitch. 9 people organized around the management of a subject that no scientific institution in the world was officially studying. Drew's orientation covered the protocols governing Mitch's work. The feeding allocation was 2 pounds of raw beef per feeding, 2 feedings per day, morning and afternoon. Commercial-grade beef measured by weight on a kitchen scale. The allocation was slid through the feeding port on a metal tray. Documentation required noting the subject's position in the cage during feeding, any vocalization or visible behavioral response, and the time the tray was cleared. Drew outlined the proximity protocol: no staff member within arm's reach of the bar structure without a second staff member present. No extended direct eye contact with the subject, which had been associated in the behavioral log with an elevated attention response. Staff were not to address or speak directly to the subject during routine operations. Any interaction beyond what standard protocol required was reportable to Morris. Drew delivered all of this in a flat, efficient tone, moving through the points the way someone moves through a checklist they have run many times. When Mitch asked why the feeding allocation was set at 2 pounds for a subject of that size, Drew said it was the established protocol and that protocol questions went to Morris. Then he moved on. Mitch did not ask Morris. He already knew the answer to the calculation. 2 pounds of raw beef twice a day provides roughly 3,000 calories. For a subject of that mass and that visible muscle density, the caloric requirement would be considerably higher. He had done enough large animal nutrition work in his years at the rehabilitation facility to run the math without a calculator, and the math told him that the protocol allocation was well below what the subject needed to maintain the muscle mass and immune function that its size indicated it was capable of supporting. That was not a research outcome. That was a different calculation entirely. He also knew within the first 2 days that the subject was watching him differently than it watched the other staff. When Drew moved through the containment room during routine operations, the Dogman tracked him in the same peripheral way it tracked the security personnel who occasionally passed the anteroom with access to the outer door. Registered, cataloged, not engaged with. When Mitch entered for the second morning in a row, the Dogman stood up from its corner and walked to the front of the cage. Not quickly, not with any display of aggression or alarm. Deliberately, with the measured quality of a thing crossing a space to take a better look at a new variable. It came to the bars and stood there while Mitch was beginning the morning cleaning protocol, and it looked at him with an attention that had a quality he had not encountered in any animal before and that he struggled in several of our phone calls to describe adequately. Not threat assessment, not hunger-related focus, not the specific alert attention of a predator tracking movement. The attention had a quality of evaluation. It was working out what category to put him in, taking its time, running whatever process it ran when it encountered something it had not yet fully characterized. He kept moving. He maintained his protocol pace and route. He spoke at barely audible volume, not addressing the Dogman directly, just a low, continuous sound, the same technique he had used with every frightened or injured thing he had handled. When he finished and left the room, the Dogman was still standing at the front of the cage, still watching the door he had gone through. He did not log the interaction in the behavioral record. It did not feel like data. It felt like something that belonged to him for a while before it needed to belong to anyone else. The camera blind spot was on the west side of the containment room, behind one of the original building's structural support columns, a concrete pillar that ran floor to ceiling as part of the foundation-level framework. The monitoring cameras were mounted at the room's 4 corners and provided overlapping coverage of almost the entire floor space. But the column interrupted the sight line from 2 of the 4 cameras and produced a zone of approximately 5 feet by 4 feet that was not captured by any active camera. Mitch discovered it in his 3rd week by noticing that when he stood near the column during cleaning operations, the motion indicator on the nearest camera did not respond to his movement as it should. He stood there for about 30 seconds, not moving, and looked across the room at the cage. The Dogman was on its elevated platform. When Mitch stopped in the blind spot, the quality of its attention changed. He could feel it change from across the room, the narrowing of focus, the sharpening that preceded a decision. The Dogman had noted the column's position long before Mitch had. It was now noting that Mitch had found it too. He began bringing supplemental food the following week, carried in the inside pocket of his work jacket, pieces of cooked chicken and sometimes fruit, and a handful of almonds wrapped in paper. During the routine morning feeding, after sliding the official allocation through the port, he would work his way naturally through the cleaning protocol to pass briefly through the blind spot and then through the narrow passage on the cage's west side, between the bar frame and the room wall, where the camera angles were poor. He placed the additional food on the cage floor through the bars during those seconds in the passage, withdrawing his hands before the Dogman could reach them if it chose to. The first 3 times, the Dogman retrieved the food after Mitch left the room. When he reviewed the monitoring footage that evening, it collected the supplemental food in silence after the door closed. On the 4th occasion, it came to the secondary position while Mitch was still in the narrow passage. It moved without hurry to the bars, lowered itself, and took the food from the cage floor without touching Mitch's hands or making any sound. Then it straightened and moved back to the center of the cage. Mitch did not move while this happened. When the Dogman was back in the center of the room, he finished his protocol and left. His heart was running fast in a way that had nothing to do with fear. After that, the supplemental feeding became a fixture of the morning routine that neither of them acknowledged visibly, and that the facility's monitoring system never captured on film. The staff at the facility occupied their roles with the specific quality that extended, isolated work in unusual conditions produces in people. A kind of functional self-containment, a reduction of emotional presentation to what was operationally necessary. Drew had been at the facility for nearly 2 years by the time Mitch arrived, long enough to have absorbed the facility's clinical detachment completely. He was good at his work in the sense that he performed the required tasks accurately and without incident, but Mitch noticed within the first few weeks that Drew never spent more time in the containment room than protocol required. He completed his tasks and left. The quality of his movement in the containment room had a specific acceleration to it, a preference for staying near the exit door, a fixed orientation that kept the cage in peripheral vision rather than direct line of sight. Drew had found a way to be in that space without engaging with it, and the way was to keep the thing in the cage just far enough in the edge of his awareness that it did not have to become fully real. Leanne managed the facility's documentation and communications with efficiency and without evident emotional response to the material she worked with daily. She was the person who built and maintained the behavioral logs, the health records, the communication protocols that kept the facility connected to Morris's supervisory network and to the organization's leadership, which existed at a level above Morris that Mitch was never introduced to and never saw. She had a background in medical records administration that showed in everything she did. Accurate, organized, without editorial. She told Mitch one thing at 4:30 in the morning in the kitchen when neither of them could sleep. She said she had started muting the audio channel on the monitoring footage before she logged the overnight records. He asked why. She said the Dogman's vocalizations during the night hours produced a response in her that she did not want. He asked what they sounded like. She said they sounded like a person talking in a language she did not understand, and that the longer she listened, the more she felt on the edge of recognizing it, and that she found that sensation worse than not understanding at all. She said this once and did not repeat it, and he never raised it with her again because both of them understood that what she was describing required an acknowledgement that neither of them could make out loud in a facility where every conversation near a monitoring device was potentially on record. Morris ran the facility with the authority of a man who had spent enough years in command of people under difficult conditions. That authority had become less a behavior than a posture. He was former military, which was evident in how he organized himself and the space around him. He was not warm and he was not cruel. He was focused, which in practice produced what looked from outside like indifference to everything that did not serve the research objective. His interest in the Dogman was genuine and consuming. He wanted to understand what it was in the way an engineer wants to understand a machine, how it worked, what its limits were, what the relationship was between input and output. His research methodology, reconstructed by Mitch from observation, was organized around controlled stimulus presentation and behavioral response documentation, introducing novel stimuli through the feed port and recording response, introducing auditory stimuli through the ceiling-mounted speaker in the containment room, recordings of wildlife and of humans and of vehicles and of natural sounds, and documenting reaction in terms of posture, position, and vocalization. Conducting periodic light deprivation sessions, blackouts of the containment room lasting several hours, with thermal cameras maintaining surveillance during the dark period. Mitch watched the dark period sessions from the monitoring station. The Dogman's response to total darkness in the containment room was not fear, and it was not inactivity. In darkness, it moved around the perimeter of the cage with the systematic quality it did not display in lighted conditions. It spent extended periods at the door mechanism. It worked at the points where the bar frame connected to the mounting structure in the ceiling and floor. It worked at the bars with its hands that the thermal camera's resolution was not sharp enough to fully capture, but that Mitch, watching the thermal footage from the monitoring station, interpreted as manipulation, fingers working at the lock assembly, the hinge connections, the junction points between structural elements. Then the lights would come on and it would return to its position, and the still watchful quality of its daytime presence gave no indication of what it had been doing in the dark. The dark was its private time. Mitch noted this consistently and included none of it in the official behavioral log, where the dark period sessions were recorded as producing no behavioral anomalies, which was accurate only if you defined anomaly as deviation from normal animal behavior, rather than as deviation from normal behavior for something that was not entirely contained within that category. The longer Mitch spent at the facility, the harder that distinction became to maintain. By his third month, he had built a detailed internal understanding of the Dogman's behavioral geography in the cage. It knew the feeding schedule to within a few minutes. It knew the shift change schedule, the cleaning days, the timing of Morris's assessment visits, the security rotation. It positioned itself differently in different parts of the day based on what it anticipated, not what had already happened. On feeding mornings, it was near the food port before Mitch arrived. On shift changes, it was on the elevated platform with a clear sight line to the entry door. On Morris's assessment visits, it moved to the far corner and turned slightly away, presenting its back at an angle that communicated not indifference but a considered withholding of engagement, as if it had decided that Morris was not worth the energy of visible response and was communicating this in a register it trusted Morris to read. The incident with the security man happened in Mitch's fourth month. The larger of the two security personnel had a habit of striking the cage bars with his baton during his nightly rounds through the anteroom. Not a sanctioned protocol behavior, but a personal choice. The sound rang through the bar structure and the vibration carried, and the effect on the Dogman was a flinch, a brief disruption of its characteristic stillness. The security man did it because the visible reaction gave him a sense of having some authority over something that was, at a purely physical level, more capable of harm than he was. Mitch observed this for about 3 weeks and then raised it with Morris as a research methodology concern. Uncontrolled aversive stimuli were a confounding variable in the behavioral data. Morris noted it, and the bar striking stopped within 2 days. What Mitch observed in the 3 days after it stopped was more informative than any of the official behavioral documentation. For 3 days, the dogman watched the containment room door at the specific times when the security man's rounds typically brought him past the anteroom. The attention directed at that door during those times was specific and concentrated, distinguishable from the dogman's general environmental surveillance. Then at the end of the 3rd day, the watching stopped. The dogman returned to its normal distribution of attention. Whatever calculation it had been running about the security man and the cessation of the bar striking was complete. The decision it had reached was held internally, disclosed in no visible behavior, filed for whatever use it would be put to later. That capacity for internal processing over extended time periods was what separated what was in that cage from any behavioral framework Mitch had worked within before. Animals can sustain patience in the context of hunting. They can wait out a threat. But the patience he observed in the dogman had a strategic quality that hunting patience does not. It was the patience of something with a plan that extended beyond the current stimulus set. The patience of a mind operating on a timeline the facility's research program was not designed to detect. Morris escalated the research protocols in the fall of 2005. The communications flowing from the organization's leadership through Leanne's system had increased in frequency and apparent urgency, and the effect on Morris's methodology was visible. Dark period testing increased from twice weekly to 4 sessions per week. The auditory stimulation sessions grew longer and louder. The aversive stimulation protocol escalated to continuous high-volume sound through the ceiling speaker, specific recordings selected because earlier testing had established that they produced the strongest negative response in the dogman. The dietary allocation was reduced from 2 pounds to 1 pound per feeding. The official documentation described this as a continuation of metabolic baseline research. Mitch increased his supplemental feeding as much as he could without creating contradictions in the health indicators that would prompt Morris to investigate. He brought more food per session. He went to the secondary position more frequently when the camera rotation allowed it. The dogman came to the bars faster on those mornings. It stayed at the secondary position longer after taking the food. It looked at him directly, which it had not done consistently before, holding the look for several seconds before turning away. He has spent years trying to describe what was in that look. He knows how it sounds to claim that a large captive predator looked at him with meaning in the look. He insists on it anyway. He says it was not gratitude, which is a word too small and too human. It was acknowledgement, the direct communication of recognition, from something that knew exactly what it was doing to something that knew exactly what he was doing, without any intermediary interpretation required. He said it was the most complete communication he had ever had with any living thing, because it required no translation. Both of them understood it in exactly the same way. The operational life of the facility ran on patterns that Mitch understood within the first month and came to know in finer detail with each subsequent month. The security rotation divided the 24-hour cycle into 2 12-hour shifts, with a handoff at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. Feeding windows were at 8 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. Cleaning happened on Tuesday and Friday mornings, scheduled at 9 to follow the morning feed and allow the subject time to settle before the cleaning protocol required staff to work the cleaning port while the dogman was present in the cage. Morris's assessment visits were nominally unscheduled, but in practice fell into a pattern that anyone paying attention could map within 6 weeks. Late morning on Mondays and Thursdays, usually between 10 and 11:30. The monitoring station ran continuously, with Leanne reviewing and logging the previous 24 hours of footage each morning between 7 and 9. Kyle ran system checks on the generator and the mechanical infrastructure on the 1st and 15th of each month, and performed reactive maintenance as needed when a flag arose. The facility's supply deliveries happened on Wednesdays. Food for the kitchen, the raw beef allocation for the feeding protocol, cleaning materials, fuel for the generator. Mitch learned all of this within 4 weeks. He knew it because it was his job to know the operational schedule. What he observed in his 5th and 6th weeks was that the Dogman knew it too, and had known it longer than he had. The clearest demonstration was the response to delivery days. On Wednesdays, the supply vehicle arrived at the facility on the access track sometime between 9 and 10 in the morning. The sound of a vehicle on the access track was audible in the containment room because concrete walls of that thickness transmit low-frequency vibration rather than blocking it entirely, and the vehicle on the unpaved track produced a characteristic low-frequency profile as it crossed the drainage culverts at the bottom of the hollow. On the Wednesdays, Mitch spent time in the containment room during the delivery window. The Dogman was on its elevated platform well before the vehicle was audible to Mitch, elevated above the floor, with its head positioned toward the north wall that was closest to the access track approach. The elevation gave it a slight acoustic advantage in detecting the low-frequency vibration through the building structure. It had mapped the delivery pattern, identified the auditory signature that preceded delivery days, and was using that information to position itself with advance awareness of a day on which personnel movements would be slightly different from the standard pattern. Mitch noted this in his personal journal, which he kept in the inside pocket of his work jacket and wrote in during personal time in the dormitory. The personal journal was not a protocol document. It was a private record of what he was observing. He had maintained private field notes in his years at the wildlife rehabilitation facility, a habit he had developed from working with an experienced wildlife biologist who had told him early in his career that the most important observations were usually the ones that did not fit the existing documentation categories, and that the only way to preserve them was to write them down somewhere that the documentation categories could not reach. He noted the delivery day positioning. He noted the quality of attention the Dogman directed at the electronic keypad lock on the inner containment room door when Morris entered and left. A continuous, specific focus that was distinct from the ambient environmental monitoring the Dogman maintained throughout the day. He noted that during the weeks when Mitch's personal schedule required him to enter the containment room at slightly different times than the established protocol rhythm, the Dogman's positioning anticipated his arrival by more than the auditory signature of his footsteps could account for, suggesting either heightened sensory capacity that allowed it to detect him through the building before he was audible to himself, or a secondary predictive model based on his personal schedule that it had built independently of the facility's official protocol schedule. He wrote in the journal, "It knows where everyone is at most times." He crossed that out and rewrote it. "It knows where everyone tends to be at any given time and adjusts its expectations accordingly." He crossed that out too. He wrote, "It is tracking us the way a hunter tracks." Then he closed the journal and put it in his jacket pocket and did not look at that page again for several weeks. The dark period sessions produced behavioral footage that Mitch reviewed privately in the monitoring station during the hours of quiet in the facility, after the main operational day was done and before the security personnel's late round check. The thermal cameras in the containment room recorded the Dogman's movements in total darkness with enough resolution to distinguish posture and gross motion, though not enough to capture fine detail. What the thermal footage showed consistently across the dark period sessions was a behavioral repertoire that had no parallel in anything Morris's published stimulus response framework would have predicted. The Dogman used the dark period for what Mitch could only describe as focused investigation. It would start each dark period session at the elevated platform, remaining still for the first few minutes after the lights died. Then it would descend from the platform and move to the door of the cage. It spent time at the door. The thermal footage was not sharp enough to show what it was doing with its hands at the door, but the posture, the continuous stillness at a specific location combined with the thermal signature of heat radiating from the hands concentrated at a single point rather than distributed along the arm, was consistent with manipulation, with the fingers working at something. At the lock assembly or at the connection points between the door frame and the bar structure. Then it would move to the points where the bar frame was anchored in the floor, spending time at each anchor, and then to the ceiling mount points. The circuit was thorough and it was repeated across multiple dark period sessions with the consistency of a process being executed rather than random exploratory behavior. It was working through its containment systematically in the sequence that made physical sense, starting with the most accessible points of potential failure and working outward. After the circuit of the structural points, it sometimes vocalized, not loudly. The ceiling microphone picked up what Mitch, listening to the recordings with the volume raised, could only describe as quiet, structured sound, low in frequency with a rhythmic variation that suggested call and response or self-directed recitation rather than the expression of distress or alarm. Leanne's description of the overnight vocalizations as sounding like a person talking in a language she did not understand had struck Mitch as accurate enough that he had not been able to improve on it when he tried to formulate his own description. He did not try too hard. He understood that the territory of meaning the vocalizations occupied was not one he had the background to enter accurately, and that the most honest thing he could do was document that the territory existed. By his 7th month at the facility, Mitch had developed a working model of what the Dogman was doing in its time in the cage, built from his personal journal entries and from the footage he had reviewed outside the standard monitoring rotation. The model had 3 components. First, the Dogman was mapping the facility's operational patterns with the same thoroughness it was mapping the structural characteristics of its containment, building a predictive model of when specific events would occur, who would be present, and how movement through the facility would flow. Second, the Dogman was using the dark period sessions to work through the physical characteristics of its containment, at a pace that left no visible evidence in the lighted periods when surveillance was active. Third, the Dogman was waiting, not for a random opportunity, but for a specific configuration of circumstances that its accumulated mapping would allow it to identify in advance. This model pointed to a gap that the facility's research program was not designed to detect. The Dogman was not adapting to captivity in the way that Morris's methodology assumed it would. Morris's behavioral research was built on the assumption that the subject was responding to stimuli in the present, and that the accumulation of stimulus-response data across sessions would eventually characterize the subject's behavioral range. The actual process underway in the cage was different. The subject was running a research program of its own, and the timeline of that program extended beyond any individual session or any individual month, and its objective was not characterization but exit. Morris's methodology was studying a process that was studying him back, and the process studying him back had the clearer view. The geography of Buchanan County that surrounded the facility is more distinctive than most people outside the region understand. The Russell Fork of the Big Sandy River, which drains the county's southeastern portion before meeting the Lavisa Fork at Hasey, has cut its channel through Pine Mountain over millions of years. And the result at the Virginia-Kentucky border is the Breaks Gorge. 5 miles of canyon with walls that reach 1,600 feet from rim to river in the deepest sections. The deepest gorge east of the Mississippi River, managed as an interstate park by Virginia and Kentucky jointly. The terrain above the gorge on the Virginia side is mixed upland forest of oak, hickory, and tulip poplar over sandstone with eastern hemlock in the ravines, and rhododendron and mountain laurel closing in along the creek bottoms in ways that make 30 yards of visibility feel generous. The hollows that drain into the Russell Fork from the county's interior are narrow and deep, with canopy closing overhead quickly enough that the bottom of a hollow feels removed from the surrounding ridgeline even when the ridgeline is only a few hundred feet above. You can be moving through a hollow that appears on a topographic map and still feel entirely lost in it because the terrain does not allow for the sight lines that tell a person where they are. This country has been inhabited for a very long time before anything that history books call settlement arrived. The archaeological record of the Upper Russell Fork watershed documents continuous human presence from the Paleo-Indian period through the late prehistoric period and into the historic era, when the Cherokee and Shawnee peoples used the ridgelines and river bottoms of far southwestern Virginia as hunting territory and as the contested boundary zone between their respective territorial claims. The Cherokee, whose principal towns were further south and east in what is now eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina, held the river drainages of the Virginia coalfield country as seasonal hunting ground. The Treaty of Long Island of the Holston, negotiated in 1777 between the Cherokee Nation and the commissioners representing the Virginia and North Carolina colonial governments, formalized the boundary between Cherokee hunting territory and the expanding Virginia settlements. The Upper Clinch and Powell Rivers and the headwaters of the Big Sandy system, which includes the Russell Fork, fell inside the territory the treaty acknowledged as Cherokee. The treaty is a real document in the National Archives. The history is verifiable. The territory it describes is the same territory the facility sat in. James Mooney, the anthropologist who spent years among the Cherokee in the 1880s and 1890s, documenting their oral traditions and history for the Smithsonian Bureau of American Ethnology, recorded descriptions of beings the Cherokee called the Envi-Nehi. Mooney translated this term as those who live anywhere, or sometimes as the immortals. The beings he documented were described not as spirits in the immaterial sense, but as actual presences in the landscape, particularly in the remote places, in the deep forest and in association with waterways that existed in a parallel structure to human society without being part of it. They had their own territorial sense, their own social organization, and their own relationship with the human communities whose territory overlapped with theirs. Mooney's sources described them as capable of physical intervention in human affairs when they chose to intervene, and as associated specifically with the gorge country and the deep hollows where human presence was difficult to sustain. The elders who spoke to Mooney were selective about what they shared. The documentation he produced reads as the record of people conveying enough to confirm the category while preserving the specifics for audiences who had earned the right to hear them. The Shawnee, whose operational range included the Ohio Valley and the Kentucky and Virginia backcountry, used the Lavisa Fork Valley as a route through the mountains in their raids on the Virginia frontier settlements during the colonial period and into the early Republic. Traders and surveyors working the far southwestern Virginia territory during the settlement period recorded conversations with Shawnee guides who described certain sections of the gorge country, particularly the deep hollows off the Russell Fork drainage, as places where specific caution was warranted not because of rival nations or terrain hazard, but because of what lived in them. The descriptions in those accounts are vague, because the guides did not elaborate to outsiders, but the consistent element across the surviving written record is size and upright movement, and a quality of intelligence that the Europeans found confusing when filtered through their experience of known wildlife. Linda Godfrey, whose 3 decades of documented research on the Dogman phenomenon represent the most comprehensive public record available on this subject, identified waterway association as one of the most consistent behavioral markers across her entire case database. The thousands of independent accounts she reviewed over 30 years of active research showed the same clustering. Sightings concentrated near rivers, creeks, lake shores, and reservoir edges regardless of geographic region, regardless of the cultural background of the witness, regardless of the time period. The Russell Fork and its tributaries fit that marker exactly. The gorge terrain that runs along the watershed provides what a large territorial intelligence needs. Cover that allows movement without observation, water access, prey concentrations at the margins between forest and water, and the kind of deep remoteness that generates the minimum of human intrusion even in a county that sits within reasonable drive of larger cities. Steve Cook's work, beginning with the song he recorded for a Traverse City, Michigan radio station in 1987 as an April Fool's piece and continuing through his decades of subsequent report collection, established a permission structure for witnesses who had been carrying their accounts in silence because the cultural context did not provide a frame within which those accounts could be expressed without personal cost. When Cook's song aired and his station received responses from people who recognized what he had described from their own experiences, the consistency of the incoming accounts across geography and time period was the thing that turned a prank into a serious research record. Witnesses in Michigan described the same physical characteristics that witnesses in Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee and Texas described independently, without communication with each other across decades. That consistency is not explicable as shared mythology. Shared mythology produces variation over time and distance, embellishment, cultural inflection. What Cook's report collection and Godfrey's subsequent research documented was consistency so stable across time and distance that it functioned as a fingerprint. The 1887 Wexford County encounter, documented in newspaper reporting from the Traverse City area and representing the earliest modern North American account of the Dogman on record, described two lumberjacks encountering a figure at the edge of a logging cut that had a man's body and a dog's head and moved on two legs out of the timber. The account predates any cultural context for the Dogman by nearly a century. It is in the public record. The accounts from the Russell Fork country, the retired surveyor and the anonymous game warden and the coal truck driver follow the same pattern. People with no cultural framework for what they saw, describing what they saw anyway, carrying it in silence because the social cost of disclosure exceeded the benefit, and occasionally releasing it through the kind of off-the-record channels that do not produce citable documentation but do produce a consistent thread if you know where to look. The behavioral profile across those accounts is consistent with every pattern Godfrey documented in her Great Lakes research. Association with waterways, nocturnal or crepuscular activity, territorial behavior that emphasizes warning over violence, awareness of human observation, the specific restraint that distinguishes Dogman encounters from encounters with large predators, a choice not to attack when attacking was clearly possible, a preference for making the human uncomfortable enough to leave over making the human unable to leave at all. That behavioral profile was visible inside the facility too. Not in the form of territorial marking or coordinated outdoor movement because those behaviors require a territory to conduct them in. In the facility, the same underlying intelligence expressed itself in the forms available to it. The systematic study of its containment, the cataloging of the personnel around it, the maintenance of a private research program that ran in parallel to Morris's official one, and the patient accumulation of whatever would be needed when the opportunity came. The facility's transfer switch housing had been found with physical damage to its access panel 12 days before the storm that ended everything. Kyle had documented the damage in his maintenance log. The lock cylinder of the housing access panel had been deformed, subjected to compressive force from outside by a grip of sufficient force to compress a 12-gauge steel casting. Kyle had ordered a replacement component. The replacement was on back order and had not arrived by the night of January 7th. Whether the housing had been damaged recently, in the days immediately before Kyle found it, or whether it had been damaged weeks earlier as part of a longer preparation, was not determinable from the damage alone. He noted it, he ordered the part, he moved on. The ice storm that hit far southwestern Virginia on the 7th of January 2006 was among the most significant winter weather events in the region in 2 decades. The system moved northeast out of the Tennessee Valley, crossing into Virginia from the southwest, bringing precipitation that began as rain in the afternoon and transitioned through sleet to solid freezing rain as the surface temperature dropped through the evening. The ice accumulation on the trees along every power line corridor in the county was sufficient to bring down branches that would normally clear the conductors, and the grid failures cascaded across Buchanan County through the night. By midnight, the county's power infrastructure was substantially down. The facility's grid power failed at 11:48. Mitch was in the dormitory trying to sleep unsuccessfully when the lights died. The emergency lighting came on within seconds, low LED strips at floor level washing the room in a dim red. He sat up on his bunk. He heard Kyle moving fast in the corridor toward the generator room. Leanne's voice came through the staff intercom, which ran on battery backup, asking for status. One of the security personnel responded that he was moving to the anteroom to do a visual check on the containment area. The other took a position at the main corridor intersection. Morris was not at the facility that night. He had driven to Grundy for a scheduled communication with the organization's leadership, and the storm had developed faster than forecast, leaving him stranded in town. His calls to the facility's communication line began at around midnight. The generator's automatic transfer switch did not engage. Kyle worked in the generator room to initiate a manual bypass of the damaged transfer circuit. The manual process required specific steps in sequence and took time. 11 minutes elapsed between the grid failure and the moment Kyle engaged the generator manually, and the facility's main power came back online. In those 11 minutes, every electronic lock in the facility was unpowered. The physical door hardware remained mechanically engaged. An electronic lock in the locked state with power removed retains its mechanical engagement, and releasing that engagement without power requires the manual keypad backup, a 4-digit code entered on a non-electronic keypad. Each secured door in the facility had one inside the anteroom and in the containment room per emergency protocol. The code for the containment room's inner door backup keypad was 5472. It was printed on a laminated card and posted inside the anteroom per the facility's own emergency procedure documentation, so that any staff member in the anteroom during a power event could access the containment room if necessary. When Kyle engaged the generator and the monitoring cameras came back online, the Dogman was in the main corridor. It had gone through the inner containment room door, through the anteroom and through the outer reinforced door to the corridor. Both mechanical keypads on both doors. In 11 minutes of total darkness with no one in the anteroom, it had moved to the door, worked both keypads in sequence, and opened both doors without assistance. Mitch has spent 20 years with this fact. He does not have an alternative explanation. The Dogman had watched the keypad entries during routine operations, including Morris's entries on assessment days and the security personnel's entries on their checks. It had observed the sequence enough times over enough months to retain it. In the dark, by feel, it used what it had retained. It could have done this at any point. It had waited for an 11-minute window when the electronic lock layer was also disabled, so that when the mechanical release was worked, nothing electrical would remain to resist the door. The camera footage that came back online when the generator engaged showed the Dogman moving south in the main corridor in the facility's fluorescent light. Upright, its height relative to the corridor ceiling, which Mitch knew from measurement was 8 feet, put the top of its skull at around 7.5 feet. The movement was purposeful and unhurried, covering the corridor at a pace that was not rushed, the way something moves when it knows exactly where it is going and has no reason to hurry. Mitch was watching the monitoring feed from the dormitory display. He saw the corridor footage. He reached for the deadbolt on the dormitory door and locked it. He moved to the wall beside the door, not in front of it. He heard the first impact from the south section of the facility. He heard a second, and then silence, and then a different quality. He will not describe these sounds in further detail. He has been asked to multiple times, and he declines each time. He says describing them precisely would require thinking about them precisely, and that he has been careful for 20 years not to do that. He stood against the wall beside the locked door with his back against the concrete, and he waited. He listened to the facility. He heard movement at varying distances and with varying qualities of sound. He heard things happen that he does not describe. He managed his breathing the way he had learned to manage it in the presence of dangerous things, not suppressing it, but keeping it from accelerating beyond what the body can sustain over an extended period. He waited until the silence became absolute, until the movement sounds stopped and the facility was quiet except for the generator and the ice on the exterior walls and his own breathing. He waited longer after the silence began than seemed rational, because the part of him that had spent years reading the states of large things in enclosed spaces told him that the quality of the silence was still active for a time after the sounds stopped, and that what was active would resolve before it was right to move. When he opened the dormitory door, the corridor was empty and the fluorescents were on. He moved through the facility. He confirmed the status of every person who had been on shift that night. He did this systematically because the alternative to systematic action was no action, and systematic action was the only thing keeping him functional. 8 people. He confirmed 8 people. He did not find any of them alive. He moved through the main corridor to the containment area. The reinforced door from the corridor to the anteroom was open. The anteroom's inner door, the one with the keypad, was open. The containment room door was open. The cage inside it stood with both entry doors swung wide on their hinges. The platform, the food trough, the nest structure in the far corner, empty. The smell of the Dogman was still in the room, dense and clear, but the Dogman was not. He checked the north access door. It was standing ajar. The perimeter fence gate beyond it was open. In his flashlight beam, the ice-covered ground outside showed disturbance. The passage of a large body moving downslope toward the creek bottom and the forest that ran from there toward the Russell Fork drainage and the Breaks country and whatever was beyond. The marks in the ice were clear for about 30 yards before the ground steepened, and the slope carried them out of the flashlight's range. He went inside and sat on the corridor floor and called the emergency number from his phone. The voice on the other end of the emergency line was not Morris. It was someone whose voice Mitch did not recognize, who asked a sequence of brief, specific questions and gave one instruction. Stay inside. Do not leave the building. Help is coming. Mitch stayed on the corridor floor with his back against the wall and waited for the sound of vehicles on the access track. 3 vehicles. 7 men. No introductions. They moved through the facility with the efficiency of people who knew what needed to be done and had thought about the steps in advance. They gave Mitch a bottle of water and told him to stay in the dormitory. He heard the facility being processed around him through the night and into the early morning hours. He slept briefly at some point because his body made the decision for him. When the dormitory was unlocked in the morning and he was taken outside, the vehicles were still there and certain things about the facility's interior were already different from how they had been. He did not look more carefully than the distance from the doorway allowed. He was driven to Grundy. Morris was in a motel off the highway in Grundy, in a room with the curtains drawn, sitting at the small table with a yellow legal pad in front of him. He looked the way Mitch had expected him to look, which was the way a man looks when he has calculated the loss of an irreplaceable asset and is on the far side of the first accounting. Not distressed, not afraid, a state more baseline than either. He had invested heavily in an investment that had resolved in a direction he had not fully prepared for, and now he was sitting with the implications. He asked Mitch to walk through the night from the beginning, which Mitch did. Morris asked 2 clarifying questions and took notes. When Mitch finished, Morris said the organization would be in contact and that Mitch should remain in Grundy for the time being. The lawyer arrived 2 days later with a document that Mitch read over an afternoon before signing. The document was comprehensive. It covered everything Mitch had seen and done at the facility, including the supplemental feeding protocol, the language of the document making clear that Morris had known about it and had elected to allow it to continue rather than terminate Mitch's employment, a decision whose rationale Mitch has since interpreted in ways that make him uncomfortable. The financial component of the document was substantial. The terms for violation were described with the precision of language that has been designed by people who understand the consequences of imprecision in such documents. The deaths at the facility were characterized as resulting from a catastrophic systems failure event. The deceased were not named in the document. Their status was acknowledged only in language noting that appropriate compensation had been provided through appropriate channels. Mitch has searched the public record in the years since for any documentation of the 8 people who did not leave the facility that night. Missing persons filings, obituaries, employment records, social media traces, anything. He has found nothing. The people who worked at the facility were, for the most part, people who had been recruited from populations with limited public footprints. People whose departure from regular contact with family or community would generate fewer questions than the departure of people with extensive social connections would generate. That was not an accident. The recruitment methodology had been designed with exactly this contingency in mind. Morris's calculation in building the facility and organizing the research program and selecting the personnel and managing the operational protocols over 2.5 years had a gap in it that Mitch only recognized fully in retrospect. The gap was not in the security systems. The lock hardware was substantial, and the monitoring coverage was thorough, and the personnel protocols had been designed with the assumption that a large captive predator's most dangerous moments were the ones closest to physical contact. The gap was in the underlying model of what the captive predator was. Morris's model was a large, intelligent animal, capable of learning from experience, capable of complex behavioral responses to environmental stimuli, capable of some degree of social cognition, but ultimately constrained by the cognitive ceiling that defines animals as distinct from whatever category sits above that ceiling. Within that model, the research program Morris had built was appropriate. The dark period monitoring captured behavioral activity. The auditory stimulation mapped response ranges. The dietary reduction protocol documented metabolic tolerance. These were legitimate methodologies for studying a large, intelligent animal. What they were not was a methodology for studying a large, intelligent subject that was aware of being studied and was using its awareness of the research program as a data source for its own purposes. That requires a different framework entirely, one that acknowledges that the observer and the observed are engaged in a mutual process, and that the observed may be the more accurate observer. Morris's framework did not accommodate that possibility. Building it in would have required acknowledging at the outset that what was in the cage was not a research subject in the conventional sense, but a sovereign intelligence being studied without its consent, which is a different ethical category entirely, and one that the organization was not prepared to engage with. The question that does not resolve, that Mitch has returned to consistently for 20 years without finding an answer that satisfies him, is what happened at the dormitory door. He heard the dogman in the corridor. He heard it stop outside the door. He felt, and he uses the word feel deliberately as a sensory account rather than an impression, the quality of attention directed at the door from the other side. That attention held for a period of time he estimates at several seconds but acknowledges he cannot measure reliably. Then it withdrew. He heard it move away down the corridor and toward the far end of the building and eventually to the exterior access door. The dormitory door's deadbolt was a standard residential-grade hardware installation. The same physical capacity that had gone through reinforced containment hardware and a reinforced corridor door did not stop at a standard deadbolt because it chose not to stop. Mitch has one explanation. He does not hold it with certainty and he does not find it comfortable. Over months at the facility, through the supplemental feeding, through the consistency of his approach during their interactions at the secondary position, through whatever process the dogman ran in assessing the people it shared that space with, he had been categorized differently from the other 8. He had fed it when it was hungry beyond what the protocol allowed. He had done so quietly and without display at personal risk, consistently over months, without seeking any visible return. The dogman had processed this the same way it processed everything else it observed at the facility. Methodically, with long memory. When it had its night, it applied the accumulated record. 8 of the 9 people in that building were in one accounting. 1 was in a different accounting. The 1 was on the other side of the dormitory door. And the dogman, having finished what it came to finish, arrived at that door and made a decision that Mitch has been living inside ever since. He does not call it mercy. He does not call it affection. He does not assign to it any of the human emotional categories that would make the story simpler to tell and less accurate. He says it was a distinction, a behavioral distinction based on a catalog of observed interactions applied to a real-time decision with the same precision the dogman applied to everything. He had treated it differently than the others treated it. It treated him differently than it treated the others. He says that is the whole of it, and that the whole of it is enough to keep him awake at 2 in the morning for 20 years. Mitch left Virginia in 2006. He lives in a city in a different region of the country that he has asked not to be named. He changed careers by necessity, the NDA's terms, combined with the removal of his reference chain and the specific language about professional licensing and background clearance procedures made returning to veterinary or wildlife work effectively inaccessible. He works in indoor, day shift environments that do not put him near wilderness terrain, and he is functional at those jobs without distinguishing himself, which he says is exactly the amount of energy he has available for professional life after everything else that living requires from him. He married in 2009. His wife is, by his account, patient beyond what she should need to be and more generous than he has earned. She knows the shape of what happened in Virginia in 2006 without knowing the substance. That something happened at a job he took out of state, that it was catastrophic, and that it cost him things he has not been able to get back. She has adapted to the specific forms that cost takes in their daily life, the insomnia that has persisted for 20 years, the preference for sight lines to exits in any enclosed space, the way he responds to certain sounds at night, sounds that carry or that have the quality of coming from a distance rather than from the immediate environment. She does not press for more because she understands correctly that pressing would not produce what she wants it to produce. He does not hike. He does not hunt. He has not been in any forest larger than a city park since 2006. He was, before the facility, a person whose professional identity and personal orientation were built around precisely that kind of outdoor work, around the specific competence that years of wildlife handling builds in a person, the confidence that comes from knowing how to read an environment and move through it without triggering the things that occupy it. That identity is gone. What replaced it is a functioning adult life that his neighbors and his employer and his wife's family recognize as ordinary, organized around the permanent management of knowledge he cannot share with any of them. The organization that operated the facility does not exist in any form Mitch can identify. The funding entity, which was never named to him directly, has presumably continued in whatever configuration follows when an operation of that kind suffers a total loss. Morris's whereabouts are unknown to Mitch. The last time they communicated was in the motel room in Grundy when the documents were reviewed. The facility was demolished within weeks. The private land it sat on passed through subsequent ownership and is now within or adjacent to the area of land the Breaks Interstate Park has acquired through various conservation transactions over the years since 2006. Whether that adjacency is coincidence or design, Mitch does not speculate. He notes it. The last thing Mitch described to us in our final conversation, the thing he came back to at the close of it, was a detail from his first week at the facility that he had not mentioned in any of the previous conversations. He said he had not mentioned it because he was not sure what it meant, and that his policy in the years since the facility had been not to share things he was not sure what they meant. He said he was sharing it now because he had decided that the uncertainty was itself meaningful, and that keeping it back was a form of editing that the record did not deserve. In his first week, before the supplemental feeding, before the secondary position, before the camera blind spot or the dark period footage or any of the understanding he had built up over the months that followed, he had been in the containment room during a routine maintenance session. Drew was handling the cleaning protocol. Mitch was observing, not yet cleared for solo operations. The Dogman was on its elevated platform in the posture it adopted when the maintenance protocol was underway, elevated with a clear sight line to the room and a position that kept the greatest distance between itself and the staff doing the work below. Drew was working the cleaning port and paying attention to the cleaning port. Mitch was standing near the north wall with a clipboard for the protocol documentation. He looked at the Dogman on the platform. The Dogman was looking at him. Not at Drew, who was doing the work. At Mitch, who was doing nothing but standing with a clipboard and looking around the room in the way a new employee looks around a room they are still mapping. The Dogman was watching him with the evaluative attention he would come to know well in the months that followed, but this was the first day he had seen it directed specifically at him, and he did not yet have a context for what it meant. What he registered was the attention itself, focused, specific, continuous in a way that distinguished it from ambient environmental awareness. It was not looking at him the way a large captive predator looks at a person who has entered its space. It was looking at him the way something looks at something it is deciding about. He looked away. He attended to the protocol documentation. When he looked back a few minutes later, the Dogman had shifted its position on the platform and was now facing partly away, toward the south wall. Not entirely away. The head was angled so that the left eye still had him in its field of view. It was watching him from an oblique angle, in a way that someone who did not know what to look for would not have recognized as watching. He recognized it. He had seen the same technique in the mountain lion at the rehabilitation facility, the careful angle of the head that allowed continued monitoring of a person while appearing to have lost interest. He wrote in his personal journal that night, in the first entry after his first full day on the job, "It is assessing me. Not threatening. Assessing." He wrote, "I think it is trying to decide what kind of thing I am." He wrote, "I do not know how long it takes to make that kind of decision." Then he wrote something that he did not share with us until the last call because he had been uncertain about it for 20 years and was only now certain enough to say it out loud. He wrote, "I think it has already started deciding. I think it decided something in the first hour. If you have spent any time in the Russell Fork country or anywhere along the gorge terrain of Buchanan County, or anywhere in the coal-field ridge country of far southwestern Virginia or eastern Kentucky on the other side of Pine Mountain, you know the kind of terrain I'm describing. Hollows that go a quarter-mile from the county road before you see anything but canopy. Ridge lines where the sandstone breaks through and the visibility drops to nothing 10 feet into the tree line. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had anything unusual happen out there. Because the reports I have been going through from that stretch of the Virginia coal field go back further than 2006. And what they describe lines up with what Mitch experienced in that facility in ways that are hard to dismiss. He does not know what it decided in the first hour. He has a hypothesis, which is that the same intelligence that cataloged his months of supplemental feeding and applied the catalog at the dormitory door may have begun its assessment of him significantly earlier than the supplemental feeding began, may have registered a quality in his presence or his manner or the quality of his attention in the first hours of contact that constituted the beginning of a category, and that the 9 months of supplemental feeding were the confirmation of a category that had been provisionally established in the first week. He does not know if this is right. He is offering it as the best interpretation he has for a detail that does not fit cleanly into any other framework he has constructed. What he knows for certain is that the Dogman began watching him specifically on day 1, before he had done anything to merit specific attention, and that whatever it was looking for in him in those first observations, the months that followed apparently confirmed that it had found it. The Appalachian coalfield country will not stop producing these accounts. The terrain is too good. The human pressure is too low. The industrial retreat has left too much ground in a state of increasing wilderness recovery for the pattern to change in the near term. The coal economy that pushed human infrastructure into the deepest hollows and the steepest ridgelines during its peak is in continued decline, and the infrastructure it built is deteriorating or being demolished or reverting to private land that sits idle, and the forest is coming back at the pace that Appalachian forest comes back when the competition from agriculture and industry withdraws, which is faster than most people expect and more completely than the record of the past century would suggest was possible. The coalfield mountains of Virginia and Kentucky are greener now than they were 40 years ago. More of the ground that was cleared for surface operations has returned to tree cover. More of the access roads are impassable. More of the hollows that were walked regularly by mining and logging operations are walked by no one, or by almost no one, or by the occasional hunter who does not venture as far in as he thought he would and does not entirely know why. What walks those hollows at night has more privacy than it has had in a century. The accounts keep coming, low and irregular, surfacing in the informal channels and occasionally in the documented record from people who have seen a thing in those mountains that they cannot place in any category they were given, and who are making the same calculation about disclosure that people in small coalfield communities have always made, and arriving at the same answer most of them arrive at, which is that the informal channel is safer than the public one, and that the public one does not have room for what they saw anyway. The Breaks Interstate Park receives its visitors at the overlook platforms and the campgrounds and the picnic areas along the developed gorge rim. The backcountry sections, the trails that run back from the rim into the Virginia interior and the Kentucky ridge country, receive a small fraction of that traffic. The sections farthest from the trailheads are walked primarily by people who know what they are doing in terrain of that difficulty. Those sections represent ground that can sustain the presence of a large territorial intelligence without that presence becoming visible to the visitor population that uses the park's developed areas. Whatever territorial adjustments were made in the months and years after January 2006 in the Russell Fork drainage and the gorge country adjacent to it, the watershed that connects that territory to the larger Appalachian network is intact and continuous and managed as protected land for most of its relevant length. whether by design or by the ordinary operation of conservation priorities that naturally protect exactly the kind of terrain that something intelligent and territorial would select, the ground is more protected now than it was when the facility was operating. Mitch believes it went back. He holds the belief that the Dogman that came out of the hollow on a January night and crossed the frozen creek and entered the forest heading toward the Russell Fork watershed returned to the ground it knew, before a coal truck and a tranquilizer in a concrete room took it away. He holds the belief that what the year and 10 months of captivity costed in ways he cannot fully assess did not prevent it from going back. He holds this belief with the specific quality of something that has been tested against everything else he knows and has not broken. He says it is the only part of the whole thing that allows him something other than wait. The Cherokee who hunted the Russell Fork watershed knew what shared that ground with them. The Shawnee who moved through the Lavisa Fork Valley knew what they were moving through. The coal surveyors and the game wardens and the coal truck drivers who encountered something on the ridges and roads of Buchanan County in the decades after the coal economy left knew what they saw, even if they did not have a word for it that their social context would accept. The knowledge is old. The documentation is thin. The Dogman itself has been walking that country for longer than any of the records, longer than the preparation plants and the drift mines and the access tracks and the perimeter fences that the organization built into the hollow off the Russell Fork tributary that the forest has now taken back completely. The facility is gone. The gorge is still there. The Russell Fork is still cutting through Pine Mountain, still running cold out of the Virginia highlands into the Kentucky watershed, still dropping through the gorge walls that have been there long enough to have stopped registering the passage of what uses their cover in the deep hours. And if you think what happened in Buchanan County tells you something complete about what is living in the gorge country of the Appalachian coal field, then you have not heard what a retired Virginia wildlife officer from Grundy told me about a series of incidents in the Breaks backcountry in the years after 2006 that suggest what went back into that territory went back changed, and that the change is still visible in the behavioral record if you know what you are looking at. The modern reports from Buchanan County and the adjacent coalfield territory of far southwestern Virginia and eastern Kentucky form a thread that is thin in volume and consistent in content. The Breaks Gorge area has generated the most geographically specific cluster of accounts, concentrated in the period between the late 1980s and the current decade. A retired hunting guide who operated out of Grundy for nearly 2 decades described in a conversation with a regional outdoors writer who published an account of it in 2011 in a small circulation hunting magazine. An encounter in the fall of 2001 on the Pine Mountain Ridge Road above the Breaks that ended his decision to guide clients into the high-terrain sections of the park's Virginia side. He was scouting a deer stand location in the early morning, well before dawn, and had stopped to listen after hearing something that he described as movement inconsistent with any deer or bear he had tracked in the area. What he saw, when he brought his spotlight up, was standing at the edge of the timber about 60 yards away, upright with its head turned toward the light. The eyeshine came back amber. The silhouette above the height of the spot was a muzzle. He held the light on it for what he estimated at 4 or 5 seconds and then cut it. When he put the light back, the tree line was empty and the only sound was what he later described as very fast movement going away. Down slope in complete darkness on terrain that he would not have run on in full daylight. He did not guide the ridge country after that. He told the outdoors writer he had no plans to. He did not use the word Dogman. He used the phrase, whatever that was, and he used it twice in the article's account of his statement. And then the magazine moved on to the next subject, and the account sat in its small circulation archive and generated no follow-up from any institutional body. The Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources Field Office in the southwestern region receives, according to a retired officer who spent over 2 decades in Dickinson, Buchanan, and Wise counties, approximately 2 or 3 reports per year of large canid tracks that the reporting party describes as larger than any wolf or dog track they have encountered. The officer, who spoke to us without identifying himself by name, said the department's response to these reports is to categorize them as misidentified black bear prints or as prints from a very large domestic dog, and to close the incident without field investigation. He said he had personally examined tracks on 3 occasions over his career that he could not identify as any known species from the track morphology, and that his reports of those tracks, submitted through the department's standard observation recording process, had been returned to him with the notation misidentified domestic canid case closed. He said he had stopped submitting those reports after the 3rd time. He said the department's database has no classification for what he was looking at, and that when a system has no classification for something, the system's response is to reclassify it as something it does have, regardless of whether the reclassification is accurate. He said that is not a conspiracy. That is just how classification systems operate. That response, repeated across the institutional landscape of southwestern Virginia, produces the same silence that similar responses produce across every other region where the Dogman phenomenon is consistently documented. The Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources is not different from the Michigan DNR in this respect, or from the U.S. Forest Service in Oregon, or from the National Park Service in Wyoming. The pattern of institutional non-classification is not regional. It is systemic. Every agency that manages wildlife in the United States operates with a species inventory that was compiled during a period when the species in that inventory were the only ones the inventory's compilers believed existed. Adding a new species to the inventory requires a process of scientific documentation and peer review and regulatory decision-making that can take years or decades even for species whose physical existence is not in dispute. For a species whose existence is disputed at the foundational level, the process is effectively infinite, because the documentation standard required to initiate it is one that cannot be met by the evidence that exists, and the evidence that exists cannot be upgraded to meet the standard without institutional support that the institution will not provide until the standard is met. It is a closed system. Mitch's case illustrates the closure more completely than most cases do because Mitch has documentation and was present for the operations that produced it, and has been legally prevented from presenting it to anybody capable of acting on it. He has the personal journal with 9 months of detailed behavioral observations from close daily contact. He has photographs of the physical evidence from the dark period investigations, the marks on the generator transfer switch housing, the structural damage to the containment room door mechanism visible in the facility's own maintenance documentation. He has the memory which cannot be photographed of what the Dogman chose to do at the dormitory door, and the 2.5 years of preceding context that makes that memory meaningful. None of this can enter the official record because the official record has no place for it, and the people who could create a place for it have no incentive to do so and significant incentive not to. The closed system closes again. The ethical dimension of what the organization attempted is something Mitch has not fully resolved in 20 years, and he says plainly that he does not expect to resolve it. He was part of the operation. He was paid to be part of it, and he was paid well for his compliance, including the compliance that covered his silence about the 8 people who did not walk out. He has lived inside that complicity for 20 years with the specific knowledge that the complicity serves the organization's interest more than it serves any other interest, including his own, and that the documents he signed were designed by people who understood that the interest alignment was not in his favor and were relying on the financial terms and the legal exposure to keep him aligned anyway. He is still aligned. He is telling us this story, which is the closest he will come to not being aligned, and he is telling it in a form that the legal terms of the documents he signed cannot clearly prohibit, because what he is providing is a narrative account without names, without specific property descriptions that could be connected to any recorded deed transaction, and without any documentation that exists as physical evidence that could be seized. He is providing words. Words are not covered by the document's terms, or at least not covered in a way that would survive the First Amendment analysis that would follow if anyone tried to enforce the coverage. He has had this analysis done by someone he trusts at his own expense more than once. The Breaks Gorge itself, the physical geography of the place, is part of the story in a way that the story does not fully articulate until you have stood at the rim and looked down at the Russell Fork 1,600 feet below you. The gorge is not a recreational wonder in the way that most American gorges described as natural wonders are recreational wonders. It is difficult in ways that the developed sections of the park do not prepare visitors for. The trail system in the park's backcountry sections drops into the gorge on grades that require attention and physical capacity that is not universal. The gorge walls in the sections away from the developed overlooks are not accessible from below without technical equipment. The river at the bottom is cold and fast, and the canyon it runs through is narrow enough in places that it does not see direct sunlight for significant portions of the winter day. The terrain inside the gorge, between the river and the walls, is a tangle of fallen rock and vegetation that rewards only the most determined navigation. It is, in short, exactly the kind of terrain that would appeal to something that valued inaccessibility and that had the physical capacity to use the gorge as a refuge and a travel corridor without being constrained by the limitations that constrain human navigation of the same space. The Russell Fork, which drains out of the gorge into the Levisa and eventually into the Big Sandy and the Ohio, connects the Buchanan County territory to the broader river system of the Central Appalachians. The Big Sandy watershed, which the Russell Fork feeds, drains a large portion of the coal country territory of eastern Kentucky and the adjacent West Virginia border counties. The connectivity of that watershed system means that a territorial intelligence using the Russell Fork drainage as its core territory has access, along the waterway corridors, to a much larger landscape than the county and its immediate surroundings. The gorge country, the Levisa Fork Valley, the Big Sandy tributaries in Kentucky, the upland terrain between those drainages, all of it is connected by the watershed system in a way that makes the relevant territory much larger than any single county's boundaries would suggest. The Dogman that used the hollow off the Russell Fork tributary before the organization built its facility there was not limited to that hollow or to that county. It was using that hollow as part of a larger territorial pattern that the facility's construction interrupted at one node without affecting the rest of the network. What happened at the facility did not change that network. What went back into the gorge country in January of 2006 went back to a network that had not been disrupted by a year and 10 months of one individual's absence. Whatever social or territorial adjustments the absence had required among the others who used the network, those adjustments had been made over the months of the absence and resolved before the return. The gorge country is not a disrupted territory. It is an occupied territory that had one of its occupants temporarily removed and then restored. The specific behavioral intelligence that the facility's cameras documented over 2.5 years, the lock study, the camera awareness, the delivery day positioning, the dark period systematic investigation of containment structure, the cataloging of personnel and their patterns. All of that is not individual intelligence that dies with the individual who demonstrated it. It is the product of a cognitive system that has developed over whatever time span is relevant to the species, and that system is present in every individual of the species in the way that the capacity for language is present in every individual human, regardless of whether any particular human has spoken any particular sentence before. The individual at the facility demonstrated specific instances of that cognitive system. The system itself is distributed across the population that occupies the watershed network. Whatever the facility's operation added to the collective behavioral knowledge about human containment attempts, that addition did not disappear when one individual walked out of a hollow in Buchanan County on a January night. That is the part of the story that carries the most weight for Mitch in the years since, heavier than the dormitory door, heavier than the documents, heavier than the knowledge of what he found in the south corridor when he moved through the building after the generator came back. The dormitory door is resolved in its way. He knows what happened, and he knows the explanation that fits the evidence, and he lives inside that explanation with whatever degree of peace is available to him. The documents are resolved in their way. He signed them, and he lives inside them, and they have constrained his life in specific ways that he manages. What is not resolved, what he says he will never fully resolve, is the implication of what the 2.5 years of observation produced as a finding. The finding is this. The dogman at the facility was operating according to an intelligence that was not the intelligence of a large captive predator. It was the intelligence of something that understood its situation in historical and strategic terms, that maintained a plan across a timeline longer than any single event, that cataloged individuals rather than types and applied those catalogs with precision across long temporal gaps, and that made choices in the midst of its exit that went beyond the requirements of its survival, and reflected something he can only describe as a moral calculation. He does not use the word moral lightly. He spent the months after the facility trying to find a word that was more precise and less anthropocentric, and he found that the more precise and less anthropocentric words, the behavioral ecology vocabulary and the cognitive science vocabulary and the ethological vocabulary, were all inadequate for what he was trying to describe. What the dogman did at the dormitory door was a moral calculation. It had assessed the humans in the building, developed positions on them that were grounded in observed behavior rather than type, and in a moment when it had the physical capability and the situational justification to make a different choice, it made the choice that the record supported. That is what moral reasoning looks like when it is stripped of language and cultural context and reduced to its essential operation. Observe, assess, differentiate, choose accordingly. He says that finding is what he lives inside more than anything else from the 2.5 years at the facility. Not the fear, which has diminished over 20 years to a kind of background awareness rather than an active state. Not the grief which he carries for the 8 people who did not walk out, imperfect and complicated as his relationship to that grief is. The finding. The implication of what the finding means about what is living in the gorge country of the Central Appalachians, and about what that in turn means about everything humans believe they understand about the cognitive and moral categories that distinguish them from the rest of the living world. The finding does not resolve, it just sits there accumulating implications for 20 years and counting. Mitch said at the end of our last conversation that he did not regret telling us the story. He said he had expected to regret it, had expected the old calculation to reassert itself, the social cost of disclosure exceeding the benefit, the documents and their terms and the familiar weight of 20 years of silence. He said the regret had not come. What came instead when the last call ended and he put the phone down was something he described as a specific kind of quiet. Not relief, because relief implies that something was over and nothing was over. Not resolution, because nothing had resolved. A quiet that came from having placed a record somewhere it had not been before, in a form that the people who commissioned the documents had not fully anticipated when they designed the terms, in words that were his and nobody else's, and that existed now in a space outside the closed system that had managed everything else about the 2.5 years at the facility. He placed a record. He said that was enough for now. The Russell Fork is still running through the Breaks Gorge. The gorge walls are still 1,600 feet from rim to river in the deepest sections. The Breaks Interstate Park still manages the overlooks and the campgrounds and the developed facilities and a backcountry system that most visitors do not enter. The hollow where the facility stood is overgrown and inaccessible, and the creek that runs through its bottom still drains south toward the Russell Fork and west through the breaks and into the Kentucky watershed. Whatever walks that hollow now in the deep hours, in the dense rhododendron along the creek banks and the sandstone shadows of the hollow's head wall. Whatever intelligence moves through the gorge country of Buchanan County by the watershed paths that predate every human institution that has ever claimed authority over that ground. It was there before the organization. It was there before the coal companies and their preparation plants and their drift mines and their access tracks. It was there before the Virginia colony and the Cherokee Treaty and the Shawnee raids and the Paleo-Indian hunters who were the first people to leave a trace in the archaeological record of the gorge country. It is a presence older than any of the frameworks that have ever been built to understand or contain it, and it is as indifferent to the question of what humans think about its existence as the sandstone itself is indifferent to the question of what the river thinks about the canyon. Mitch has not gone back to Virginia. He does not plan to go back. He says what he left in Virginia is still there, and that he means this in multiple senses. The record is there, in the hollow and the gorge and the watershed and the memory of the people who grew up in that country and carry what their grandparents told them about the deep hollows and what lives in them. He left the record there. He is part of the record. And whatever else he left there, whatever part of the person he was before January 2006 is still standing in a facility in a hollow in Buchanan County, still watching the dormitory door close on a night that has not ended for him and will not end in any way that resembles a normal ending. That part he does not discuss. He has said what he came to say. The record exists somewhere outside the closed system now. That is what he came to do. The coalfield country holds its knowledge the way it holds everything, completely, without ceremony, and for as long as it takes. The hollow where the facility stood will hold what it holds for as long as the sandstone holds the hollow. The people in Grundy and along the Lavisa Fork Valley who carry fragments of accounts about the gorge country will hold those fragments until the accounts find their way to the informal channels and circulate the way they have always circulated, low and consistent and building over time toward a weight that the formal channels have no mechanism to process, but that the landscape already understands. The landscape has always understood. The Cherokee knew it. The Shawnee knew it. The coal surveyors knew it in the backs of their minds on the ridge roads at 5 in the morning when something on the tree line made them put the truck in gear and not look back. Mitch knows it in his apartment on the upper floor every night, when the sounds of the city are quiet enough that the absence of other sounds becomes audible, and he finds himself listening for a presence at a distance that is not there but that his body has not finished looking for. What the organization's failure in Buchanan County represents in the larger context of documented attempts to study or contain Dogman is, according to everyone who has spent serious time on this phenomenon, the most complete failure of its kind on record. Complete in the sense that it produced no usable research data that remains in any accessible form, and complete in the sense that it produced a sole survivor who carries the record in a form that the organization cannot access or control despite 20 years of legal documentation designed to manage exactly that risk. The NDA covers what Mitch cannot say. It does not and cannot cover what he experienced, what he understood, what he concluded, or what the experience has done to him over 20 years of living inside it. The documents silenced the facts. They could not silence the meaning of the facts, which is where most of the weight of the story lives anyway. Mitch understands that there are people who will not believe him. He has always understood this. The calculation that drove the organization to pursue the documentation and containment program in the first place. The conviction that the existence of the Dogman was so far outside the accepted picture of the world that even credible documentation would be met with institutional dismissal was correct. Mitch has never been tempted to try to bring his account to an institution that would evaluate it on its merits because he knows the outcome of that evaluation in advance. The outcome is not disbelief necessarily. The outcome is the filing of his account in the same category where the coal company surveyor's account was filed, and the game warden's account, and the coal truck driver's account, and the National Park Service employee's internal report, and every other account from the Russell Fork watershed and the adjacent territory that does not fit the species inventory, and therefore must be recategorized into something that does. The filing is automatic. The system does not evaluate the merits of evidence that has no category. It reclassifies the evidence until it has a category, and then it files it, and the filing closes the case. Mitch has no interest in being filed. What he has interest in is the record. The specific, bounded, honest record of what he saw and did and understood over 2.5 years in a building at the bottom of a hollow in Buchanan County, Virginia. Not the record as documentation that could survive legal scrutiny or scientific peer review. The record is the experience of a person who was there, who paid attention, who kept notes, who maintained the kind of observational discipline that his years of wildlife work had built in him, and who arrived at conclusions that his years of wildlife work had not prepared him for, but that the evidence, examined carefully, required. That record is what he placed in our conversations. That record is what the story you are listening to carries. It is imperfect. It is the account of one person, unverified by any external source that can be named publicly, connected to a physical location and a set of events that no official document acknowledges. It is the kind of record that the closed system cannot process. It is the only kind of record that gets through. The specific behavioral intelligence that the dogman at the facility demonstrated across the 2.5 years of the operation is worth dwelling on because it is the part of Mitch's account that most clearly exceeds any framework built on the assumption of animal cognition. The lock keypad observation and retention, the generator transfer switch manipulation, the camera positioning and blind spot identification, the delivery day predictive positioning, the personnel cataloging with individual level differentiation and long-term retention, the dark period systematic investigation of structural containment points, the 3-day observation and filing sequence that followed the security man's bar striking cessation, the dormitory door decision. These are not examples of the same cognitive capacity at different intensities. They are examples of different cognitive operations: sensory motor learning, spatial memory, pattern recognition, predictive modeling, social assessment, strategic planning, moral differentiation. The complete list describes a cognitive profile that overlaps substantially with human cognitive capacity and diverges from it in ways that are interesting rather than limiting. The dogman does not have language, or at least does not use language in any form that Mitch or Leanne could recognize as such, though the overnight vocalizations suggest a communicative system of some kind that neither of them had the background to analyze. Without language, it operates with the cognitive machinery that underlies language. Categorization, sequence, inference, counterfactual assessment, the modeling of other minds. It used those capacities to study a facility, to map its personnel, to plan its exit, and to make a distinction at a dormitory door that saved one person's life. That is the cognitive profile of the thing Mitch spent 2.5 years in proximity to. It is not the profile of a large predatory animal. It is the profile of a sovereign intelligence that has been in these mountains for as long as anyone has been keeping records, and longer. The last morning Mitch spent in the facility before he was driven to Grundy and the motel room and Morris and the legal process was a morning in January with ice still on the exterior of the building and the generator running steadily and 7 men working efficiently in the spaces around the dormitory where he was confined. He said he spent most of that morning sitting on the dormitory bunk with his back against the wall, the same wall he had stood against on the previous night, and that he thought, in the careful and organized way of someone who knows they are in the last hours of a particular version of their life and is trying to account for it before it closes, about what the 2.5 years had been, what he had seen, what he had understood, what he had chosen to do, including the choices that the documents were now covering and the choices that the documents could not cover because they had been choices about paying attention rather than choices about action. He thought about the first week, specifically about the morning in the containment room when he had looked up from the protocol clipboard and found the Dogman looking at him specifically, from its elevated platform with the evaluative attention that he would spend the next 22 months learning to read. He thought about the column's blind spot and what it had meant that the Dogman had already mapped it before Mitch found it. He thought about the secondary position and the 9 months of mornings at the cage bars and the look that he still does not have the right word for. The look that was acknowledgement and recognition and something that sat between those two words in a space that human language has not finished building vocabulary for. He thought about the dark period footage he had reviewed alone in the monitoring station. The thermal image of hands working at a lock assembly in total darkness, methodical and patient and completely without the quality of desperation that would have made it explicable as simple escape behavior. Methodical, that was always the word. Methodical in a way that implied a timeline and a plan and a confidence that the plan would resolve correctly if the preparation was thorough. He thought about the 4-digit code on the laminated card in the anteroom, posted there by the facility's own safety protocol because the organization's emergency planning had understood that staff might need to access the containment room during a power event, and had not understood until the night of January 7th that the thing in the containment room might have the same need and the same capacity. He sat against that wall in the dormitory and thought about all of it. And he arrived at the conclusion that he has held for 20 years, and that the story we have been telling carries. What was in that cage was not a research subject. It was not a specimen. It was not an animal in any category that the word animal has ever been asked to carry. It was a presence that had been in the gorge country of the Central Appalachians longer than the Appalachians themselves have had their current shape, that had watched the Cherokee and the Shawnee and the colonial surveyors and the coal companies and the National Park Service come and go and manage and regulate and extract and protect the landscape that it had been navigating by the watershed paths since before any of those things existed, and that had spent 22 months in a concrete room built by people who believed they understood what they were dealing with, studying them, and had then demonstrated with efficiency and precision and the specific restraint that runs across every credible Dogman account from every geographic region that Godfrey's research covers. Exactly how thoroughly they had misunderstood. He sat against that wall and thought about all of that, and then the dormitory door was unlocked and a man he did not know told him it was time to go. And he went. The Breaks Gorge is 1,600 feet deep in its deepest sections. The Russell Fork at the bottom of those sections is cold and fast and clear, and it runs through terrain that has not changed in any meaningful way in the millions of years since the river first found its path through Pine Mountain. The gorge walls above the river are sandstone and shale laid down in the shallow seas of the Paleozoic, compressed and lifted by the geological forces that built the Appalachians and cut by the river over the subsequent millions of years into the canyon that the Breaks Interstate Park now manages as a recreational and conservation asset. The gorge is not primarily a recreational asset. It is a geological record and a biological corridor and a territorial feature that predates every institution that has ever tried to manage it. The park is one of the smaller and less visited of the interstate parks in the eastern United States. and the backcountry sections of the park on the Virginia side are among the least visited components of an already lightly visited facility. The trail system that penetrates the gorge backcountry is maintained at a basic level and is not well marked in the sections away from the developed overlooks. The terrain rewards experience and discourages casual exploration. The section of the park that borders the former facility site, on the western edge of the Virginia backcountry, is accessible only from the inside, from the trail system, and not from any external road that a vehicle could approach on. It is exactly the kind of terrain that has been described across every geographic region where the Dogman phenomenon has been documented as the core territory. The deep gorge, the dense creek bottom vegetation, the limited sight lines. The acoustics that carry sound in directions that do not correspond to the direction of the source. The terrain that rewards the navigation style of something that moves at night by memory and by the watershed corridors that it has mapped across decades, rather than by the trail systems that humans have built for daytime visual navigation. The Breaks is that terrain at 1,600 feet of vertical relief. Whatever uses it has the best quality core territory in the Virginia coalfield country, and the best legal protection for that territory in the form of the interstate park and its conservation mandate that the territory has had since the Virginia colony first began drawing land boundaries in the region. The organization that built its facility in the hollow off the Russell Fork tributary believed it was operating in an empty margin, a piece of abandoned industrial land at the edge of a recreational park, selected for its privacy and its concrete infrastructure. It was operating in the territory of something that had been in that landscape longer than the Appalachians have had their current form, and that had spent the month before the ice storm, quietly disabling the building's emergency backup power system. And that waited with the patience of something that had been waiting since before humans had a word for patience, for 11 minutes of darkness in which to use what it had spent 22 months learning. The hollow is quiet now. The creek runs. The sandstone is patient. The coalfield forest grows back over the broken concrete that is all that remains of the preparation plant and the carefully constructed containment room and the perimeter fence and the security cameras and everything else the organization deployed in its attempt to hold something that was not available to be held. The gorge is 1,600 feet deep and the Russell Fork is running cold at the bottom of it. And whatever moves in the back country above the gorge in the deep hours of the January nights is moving in territory it was born to, and has never truly left, regardless of what happened in the hollow in 2006 or in any of the years before or since. Mitch knows this. He has known it for 20 years. It is the specific piece of knowledge that is most consistently present for him in the apartment on the upper floor in the city far from Virginia. On the nights when he is awake at 2 in the morning managing what he carries. The fact that what he spent 2.5 years in proximity to is still there and has always been there, and will continue to be there long after every human institution that has ever tried to understand or contain or manage or protect that territory is gone. The gorge does not need the park. The park is the gorge's most recent manager. Before the park, there were the coal companies and the Cherokee and the Shawnee and the Paleo-Indian hunters, and before all of them there was the gorge, and what lived in it. And what lived in it will still be living in it after the park's authorizing legislation and the Breaks Interstate Park Commission and the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and every other institution that currently has a stake in the management of that ground, has passed into whatever follows institutional authority in the region, which is what always follows, which is the gorge and the river and the watershed and the deep hours and what moves in them. Mitch put the phone down at the end of our last call and went back to his life. The record exists now in the form you have just received it, in words that belong to the informal channel rather than to any formal one, placed in the space between what the documents cover and what they cannot cover, which is the space where the honest record of things that the formal channels cannot receive always ends up. It is there now. It will circulate the way these things circulate, quietly and at low volume and with the specific persistence of things that are true and have not found their official home yet. The Appalachian coalfield country has been circulating this kind of record for as long as anyone who pays attention to it has been paying attention. The record accumulates, the gorge is patient, so is what walks it. The modern breaks country accounts that fall after 2006, the ones that have surfaced in the informal channel and been passed along to researchers who follow this phenomenon, describe behavioral patterns that are consistent with Godfrey's documented profile, but with one additional element that Mitch finds specifically notable when these accounts are described to him. The element is the quality of the territorial claim. Accounts from before 2003 described incidental encounters. The retired surveyor, the game warden, the coal truck driver, each of them surprised by something that they had not expected to find in a specific location at a specific time. The accounts from after 2008, the ones that come from hunters in the backcountry and from hikers who ventured far enough from the developed trail system to enter the territory that borders the former facility site, describe something different. They describe encounters in which the human was not surprised but was warned, a targeted approach, a positioning of the encounter that could not be attributed to chance because the terrain did not allow for chance encounters at the distances and angles from which these accounts originate. Someone in a tree stand, well before dawn, watching the timber below. Something in the timber below watching back, from a position that required it to have known the tree stand was there before it arrived. An encounter that had the structure of a meeting rather than an accident, and that ended with the human leaving the territory and not returning. Whether the behavioral shift from incidental encounter to active territorial warning is connected to the facility's operation and its outcome, Mitch cannot say. He does not know whether the Dogman that was in the cage was the individual responsible for the post-2006 accounts, or whether those accounts involve other individuals from the same watershed territory, whose behavioral patterns may have been affected by the year and 10 months of the facility's operation, in ways that Mitch cannot map without information he does not have. He notes the timing. He notes the behavioral signature. He notes that what the post-2006 accounts describe, a territorial intelligence that positions its encounters deliberately rather than allowing them to develop by chance, is consistent with what he observed in the cage across the 2.5 years of the facility's operation, and that if the individual he observed transferred any of its accumulated understanding of human behavior and human territorial systems to the broader population of the watershed territory, the transfer would be visible in exactly the behavioral shift the post-2006 accounts describe. He says he does not pursue this line of reasoning further than the observation. He has enough to carry without adding the implications of what the facility's operation may have taught a territorial species about the behavior and intentions of the humans who share its landscape. Some knowledge is better held at arm's length. He has lived inside enough of the knowledge from the facility to understand its weight, and he is careful not to add weight that the circumstances do not require him to carry. He places it here, in the record, and he lets the record carry it. The record is better equipped for that particular weight than he is. The record is here now. The gorge is 1,600 feet deep. The river is cold. Whatever walks the watershed corridors of Buchanan County and the adjacent Kentucky highlands in the deep hours of the January nights is walking them tonight. The same as it walked them in 2006 and 2003 and in 1777 when the Treaty of Long Island was signed 40 miles to the south, and in the centuries before that when the Envenahi inhabited the deep wilderness of the Cherokee homeland, and in the millennia before that, when the first people left their traces in the rock shelters of the gorge country and understood, in whatever way the first people understood things, that the ground they lived on was shared ground, and that the terms of the sharing had been established long before they arrived and would persist long after their particular arrangement with the landscape had run its course. Mitch said goodbye on the last call and put the phone down, and the record is what remains. There is a retired game warden who worked the Buchanan County and Dickinson County territories for 23 years before his retirement. A man who prefers to be identified only as a former Southwestern Virginia wildlife officer, who described to us in correspondence what he had observed along the Russell Fork drainage over the final decade of his career. He had been aware of the informal record, the accounts that circulated in the hunting community and among people who spent serious time in the backcountry of the county, long before he had his own encounter. His encounter was not dramatic in the way that would make it impossible to explain away if someone with the authority to explain things away chose to do so. He was working a pre-dawn survey on a tributary of the Russell Fork in the spring of 2009, the kind of routine wildlife count that occupies wildlife officers in the days before fishing season opens, counting evidence of spring activity in a drainage he had worked many times over the years. He found tracks in the mud along the creek bank. He photographed them. He measured them. He brought the photographs back to his department and submitted a report that came back with the standard notation about misidentified tracks, same notation that the other officer described receiving. He told us in his correspondence that what he had measured and photographed was not a bear print, and was not a domestic dog print, and was not any track morphology he had encountered in 23 years of doing exactly this kind of survey work in exactly this kind of terrain. He told us the stride pattern was bipedal. He told us the track length exceeded any measurement in the relevant database by a margin that made the misidentification notation feel, in his words, like an insult to his professional judgment. He submitted the report. He accepted the notation. He retired the following year after completing his 25-year service. He does not plan to discuss the report again with anyone connected to the department. He shared it with us because we are not connected to the department, and because the informal channel serves a function that the formal one does not, which is to let the record exist somewhere beyond the filing system that currently holds his official report, annotated with its notation, closed. The informal channel is where all of this lives. The county historian's oral history recording of the retired coal company surveyor, the anonymous Game Wardens Association newsletter item, the community forum post that was deleted and then found by a researcher years later. The correspondence from the retired wildlife officer Mitch's phone calls across the months of our conversations. None of it is in the official record. None of it meets the evidentiary standard that the official record requires. All of it describes the same thing in the same geographic territory across a span of decades, from people with no connection to each other, in language that is specific enough to be useful and vague enough to be deniable. The informal channel is not a conspiracy. It is the natural behavior of information that has nowhere to go in the formal system and needs somewhere to go anyway. The gorge country of far southwestern Virginia will continue generating this kind of information for as long as the gorge country exists, and as long as people occasionally venture into it far enough to encounter what uses it. The terrain will continue improving for the thing that lives in it as the coalfield industrial economy continues its retreat, and the forest continues its recovery. The informal channel will continue receiving what the formal channel cannot, and somewhere in an apartment on an upper floor in a city far from Virginia, a man who spent 2.5 years in a building in a hollow in Buchanan County will continue carrying what he saw and choosing, on specific occasions and in specific forms, to let some of it reach the informal channel where it belongs, where the landscape's oldest residents have always placed their knowledge, in the stories that circulate below the institutional record and outlast every system that has ever been built to contain them.